First, let me thank Alchris for this invitation. I am humbled by it, and at one point, I wondered if she had sent the email to the right person, or was there a shortage of oxygen somewhere in Manitoba, that I needed to send help for Alchris, that she was inviting me to do this. However, that being said, I have four objectives for this presentation. And the four objectives are simply to outline the factors leading to the production of the exhibition, to explain why it is important to decolonize how we recall history. Three, to discuss some of the challenges faced in the production of the exhibition, and to examine ways to continue the movement towards decolonizing history. The telling of history, my friends, is not a neutral event. The narrative we tell is often intended to make points or point which we hold as important or we wish to uphold. The African author Chinua Achebe once said, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." What this raises is an issue of how history can be used to uphold one's perspective and also eliminate, demonize, or color our own perspectives. We see this sharply when we consider the Western movies of old, what we call the cowboy and Indians movie. Notice in those movies how the indigenous people are how they are shown in the narrative of the movie. When we explore the normative narrative of the history of Canada, we usually end up with something like this. The land was first colonized by the French and then by the English. These early settlers were seeking new land and in many cases were seeking wealth. They developed the land and used the resources available to them to create the nation we now can justly be proud of. And when they arrived, by the way, they encountered humans who appeared both aggressive and childish. But through the hard work and energies of those who settled in this place, we have Canada today. I ask you for a minute to notice who is missing in the narrative offered, and I ask you to think for a minute what would be the aim of that narrative. The reality is that history will be told from the perspective of the dominant culture. Those things which highlight the dominant culture will be spoken about and sometimes embellished. Those not so good things, if included, will be explained away, and those definitely bad things will be covered up or hidden. As we came to the 100th anniversary of the United Church of Canada, I wondered what would be the history narrative that we would be telling. As I contemplated this, and as you contemplate that, I ask you to bear in mind that the church is not immune to the culture of the society. So as we tell the history, we must wrestle with these realities, the realities of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and religious intolerance in society. As we contemplate retelling history, we must also ask how the realities as outlined of our society have influenced and affected the history narrative that we are retelling. These realities, while normative, must not be considered as normal. These relatives, while normative, if we are to speak truth, then we cannot normalize them. The history of Canada is steeped in colonialism. As we tell history, we must recognize this fact and realize how colonialism affects the story we are telling. And to seek to decolonize history, therefore, is to tell history with truth. To be clear, I am not suggesting that any malintent is being suggested by the normative retelling of history. What I am saying, however, is that until we come to terms with the need to ensure a 360-degree perspective of the story we are telling, the narrative will remain incomplete. Challenges. There are obvious challenges in the production of an exhibition. The first was that none of us on the planning team had the expertise of producing an exhibition before. This meant that the first thing that needed to be done was to research how to produce a standalone exhibition. And thankfully, excuse me, there was literature available with the knowledge of this. The other obvious challenge was finance. Be honest, we started with a hope and a prayer, not with money. We started with nothing but the hope to do this, and so we literally had to go begging for funding. Undergirding all of those two obvious realities were two realities in Canada which we must come to terms with. One is aversive racism, and the other is an antipathy towards Black studies in Canada. Critical Black studies in Canada have been an underdeveloped academic discipline in Canada for a long time. Harrington Walker, in his chapter in the book Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History, produced by the University of Toronto Press in 2022, notes that it is not uncommon in Canada to suggest that looking at the history of Black people in Canada is irrelevant or unnecessary. He notes his personal experience in the 1990s when he visited a leading historian in Canada. During this encounter, he inquired about the possibility of pursuing his PhD and writing a dissertation on Black Canadian history. Walker writes that he was politely told that writing such a dissertation would prove difficult because the history of Black people in Canada was virtually non-existent and by extension irrelevant. Thankfully, this has changed and is changing to some extent. The consequence of this, my friends, is that there has been a lack of much documentation about the contribution of Black people in Canada. This is not helped by the fact that in the United Church of Canada, for example, there's not much documentation about the work of Black people who were members of the church. Fragments here, fragments there. To put it together became like doing a sort of collage. Gerald Gerald Wing Sue, in his book Microaggressions in Everyday Life, notes that the change, note speaks about, I should say, the changing face of racism in our society. He speaks about a type of racism that he calls aversive racism. In describing this type of racism, Sue notes that most white people experience themselves as good, moral, and decent human beings who would never discriminate against others on the basis of race. It is this belief that their goodwill makes them immune to racial biases that is the problem. But in believing that they are immune to racial biases, they fail to realize the ways that racial prejudice has been inherently learned in their socialization. Consequently, the expression of racism has become invisible, subtle, more indirect, and oftentimes operating below a level of conscious awareness. Aversive racism is often seen in what we call today microaggressions. What does all of this have to do with the production of an exhibition, you may ask? It goes to the issue of motivation, information, and community. Motivation, because there were distractors who were not blatantly saying to me, don't bother. Instead, it was, if you want to do this, good luck for you. You're on your own. The message was that you were on your own, and perhaps you could think of other things to do for the centenary that might be a little more popular. Information. Information was difficult to find, and in many ways it was the proverbial needle in the haystack type of thing. But it also made us realize that the exhibition was a beginning and not an end to itself. The exhibition, we acknowledge, will grow as more information becomes available. And also, we realized that the exhibition was necessary to add to the documentation gap that exists in the United Church of Canada. In many cases, it was not that the information or documentation did not exist, but it was so fragmented in different spaces that there was no cohesive or collective place where we could say, here is the history. I want to say thanks to the Diaconia of the United Church of Canada, DUCS. The what you see in the exhibition about Black women in the diaconate came because of DUCS. It was the members of DUCS who did the research for me and, and gave me the information. So, and that they were willing to do that, and that they were able to research their files and come up with this. It was very, very, very much appreciated. In order to produce an exhibition like this, one has to form a community. If not, this would be another case of a Sisyphus type solitary chore rolling a stone up a hill. Community, in that we had to realize that even in the church, that the church to which we belong did not see this initially as something that was worth being done for the whole community. Consequently, we began saying implicitly and intentionally that the exhibition was not so much the retelling of Black history, but was instead the retelling of the history of the United Church of Canada through the lens of Black people. Before starting the exhibition, we faced another challenge, the issue of language, and the issue of language had to be agreed upon. While discussing the idea with the regional executive ministers, Eric, one of the regional ministers, made it clear to me that if there was to be buy-in from the Francophone people of the church, then the exhibition had to be bilingual, French and English. Here comes the problem. The majority of members of the planning team are Anglophones only. Not that we had a problem with doing it in French, but it meant that we then had to find resources outside of ourselves to do this and to find resources that would do it at a high quality for no money. The majority of the members, the decision meant that that French that had to be done had to be given equal treatment and could not be seen as a by the way experience of the exhibition. This decision meant that we had to put our money where our words are. Yes, it would be an additional time factor to the production, and yes, it meant that we had to ensure the high quality of a French translation. And yes, all of this had financial implications. But we were determined to do it. Now that I see the exhibition and see the production of the exhibition, and I believe the other members of the planning team could not see the exhibition being done without the French translation being added. So the exhibition itself, every exhibition is rooted in what is called the big idea. This is the overall idea that guides what goes into the exhibition and guides what the exhibition should be teaching. For this exhibition here from the beginning, the big idea was even before the United Church of Canada, even before, sorry, the big idea was even before the formation of the United Church of Canada, Black people have played and are playing an important role in the shaping of the church. We then had to ask ourselves, what did we want the visitors to experience when they viewed the exhibition? So after some thought, we determined that we wanted to enable visitors to discover how Black people influenced and shaped the history, work, and witness of the United Church of Canada. With that done, we next had to determine what were the learning objectives for the exhibition. Literally, at the end of the exhibition, what did we want visitors to learn? What we determined to this end that for this exhibition, and at the end of the exhibition, visitors would be able to recall the history of the United Church of Canada from the perspective of Black people, discover aspects of the work of the United Church of Canada, interpret the history of the United Church of Canada from the perspective of Black people. This was foundation work. And like every foundation, it would therefore determine the structure of what you are building. And for us, this was important. So we built an exhibition, putting together information, saying certain things would not go in, saying that we have to hold to get more information on this, and we put it forward. For me, on the opening day of the exhibition, my heart was literally in my mouth because I wondered if people would say this was a ripe waste of time. Happily, I haven't heard those particular words being used. So what is next, my friends? Here from the beginning, as I said, is a work in progress. More information is out there, and the exhibition will be upgraded as time goes on. For example, do you know about Keystone? No, I'm not talking about the pipeline. Keystone was one of the places established by Black people who came from the United States because of the promise of land in the early 900s and because of the terror of the KKK. We know of the other famous place in Alberta called Amber Valley, which is another of the black settlements from the south-north migration. Keystone was established by black people coming from Oklahoma, and that began in 1908. It is now called, the town is now called Breton. The Breton United Church closed some years ago. But what I've been discovering is that there is history that relates that church to the early black people who moved from Oklahoma. So now we're looking at the history of the church through the lens of black people in that community. The challenge that we face in this type of work are above, were stated before. Overcoming an antipathy towards Black history in Canada, aversion, racism, the issue of financing, the issue of finding the information. And so, yes, the way forward will include financial help, but it also means a changing of culture in some regards. And the reality that here from the beginning, while it identified the history of the church through the black lens, we need to start looking at the history of the church through other lenses. For the only lens cannot be the lens of the white dominant class. If we truly want a 360 perspective of history. Thank you.